Pembina Territory, Minnesota, October, 1878. The air had already turned sharp, carrying a promise of the brutal winter to come. The poplars had surrendered their gold, and the raw skeletons of their branches clawed at a sky the color of slate. In the small settlement nestled near the Red River, the frantic, rhythmic work of survival was underway. The thud of axes echoed from the woodlots, the screech of saws from newly raised cabins, and the murmur of worried conversation drifted from the doorways of the trading post. Every sound was a race against the first deep snow. Amidst this chorus of preparation, Wilhelm Strand was an anomaly. His cabin was nearly complete, a sturdy structure of hand-hewn oak logs, chinked tight, with a mixture of clay and dried moss. The roof was on, the door was hung. But as the days grew shorter, his neighbors began to notice something profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. There was no chimney, not a single stone laid for a hearth, no dark stack rising against the gray sky. There wasn't even a round, hopeful cut in the wall for a stovepipe. Thaddeus Cork, a veteran frontier builder who had raised over 50 structures across 2 territories, finally broke the unspoken circle of suspicion. He marched over to Strand's plot, his boots crunching on the frosted grass. Cork was a man whose confidence was earned, built log by log, winter by winter. He didn't trust novelty. He trusted what worked. "Strand," he called out, his voice a low rumble of authority. Wilhelm, a quiet Swede with pale eyes and hands as broad as shovels, straightened up from his work. He was building a strange, low mound of field stone and clay against the cabin's north wall, a structure that looked more like a tomb than a part of a home. "You've forgotten the heart of the house," Cork said, gesturing with his thumb toward the blank, unbreached roofline. "Where's your chimney? A man can't get through a winter here without a fire." Wilhelm Strand wiped a smear of clay from his brow with the back of his wrist. He looked at Cork, then at the massive stone structure he was meticulously assembling. He pointed to it. "The heart is there," he said, his English clipped and precise. Cork stared at the stone monstrosity. It was 8 feet long and nearly as high as his shoulder. "That?" he scoffed, a disbelieving laugh catching in his throat. "That's a burial cairn, not a hearth. You'll get no draft from that. You're a fool, Strand. A madman. You mean to freeze your wife and children solid?" Wilhelm offered no argument. He simply turned back to his work, fitting another 100-pound stone into place with a quiet grunt of effort. The conversation was over, but for the rest of the settlement, it was just beginning. The word spread from the feed store to the post office. The new Swede, the quiet one, was building a cabin with no stove and no chimney. He was either arrogant or insane. Either way, the coming winter would surely claim his family. What did this Swedish shipwright, a man who understood the insulated hulls of icebound vessels, understand about thermal mass and slow combustion that a generation of seasoned frontier builders had completely missed? If you stick with me, I promise you will learn about one of the most ingenious and misunderstood heating systems ever devised on the frontier, the masonry heater. It's a story of how old-world physics met new-world skepticism, and how quiet knowledge can shout down the loudest mockery. Hit that subscribe button, and let's get into the science of staying warm. And do me a favor, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these old ideas can travel. Wilhelm Strand was not a fool. He was a man shaped by a different kind of cold. Born near Stockholm, he came from a long line of craftsmen who worked with wood, stone, and fire. His father and grandfather had been shipwrights, building vessels designed to wrestle with the thick ice of the Baltic Sea. From them, he learned the profound importance of a sealed hull, of insulation, and of wasting nothing, least of all energy. But his mother's family were Kakelungsmakare, master builders of the tall, ornate, and phenomenally efficient tile stoves that warmed Swedish manors and farmhouses. From them, he had learned that fire was a tool to be harnessed, not just a beast to be fed. His first winter in Minnesota in 1877 had been a brutal education. They had bought a small, hastily built claim cabin, a standard frontier box of single-walled logs. The memory of that winter was a physical ache, a ghost of cold that lived in his bones. He remembered the relentless, penetrating chill that no fire seemed to touch. He remembered his wife, Elna, a practical woman of immense fortitude, spending hours on her knees, stuffing rags and moss into the endless cracks in the chinking, fighting a losing war against the wind. He remembered the sight of his children, young Niels and little Hedvig, sleeping in their full winter coats, their breath pluming in the air of their own bedroom, just 10 feet from a cast-iron stove that glowed a menacing cherry red. He remembered waking every morning to find the water bucket by the door frozen into a solid block of ice, requiring a blow from the axe to shatter. Most of all, he remembered the woodpile. He had cut and stacked what seemed like a mountain of oak and birch, a full 8 cords. He had watched that mountain dwindle to nothing, feeding the insatiable appetite of the little iron stove, which in return gave them a pitiful circle of scorching heat no bigger than a wagon wheel. Step outside that circle, and the temperature in the cabin plummeted by 30 degrees. The floor was a permanent sheet of ice. The walls radiated a deep, cellular cold. It was a siege, not a life. One night, watching the flames devour yet another log while his daughter coughed in her sleep, he had sworn an oath. Never again. His family would not suffer through another winter like that. He would build them a house that held the warmth, a house that breathed heat, a house built not on frontier guesswork, but on centuries of Swedish physics. The fundamental failure of the conventional frontier cabin was not a mystery to Wilhelm. It was a series of obvious engineering flaws. The problem wasn't the cold outside. The problem was the design inside. He saw his neighbors making the same mistakes, trapped in a cycle of hard labor for diminishing returns. The primary enemy was conduction. A standard log wall, even a thick one, had an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of perhaps 6 or 7. Heat, following the immutable laws of thermodynamics, simply bled through the wood, seeking the colder air outside. You could have a roaring fire, but the walls themselves were thermal sieves, constantly leaking precious warmth into the frozen landscape. The second and more aggressive enemy was convection. The typical frontier fireplace or iron stove was a catastrophic failure of air management. To burn, a fire needs oxygen, a lot of it. A large open hearth could draw over 200 cubic feet of air per minute up the chimney. Where did that air come from? It came from outside, sucked into the cabin through every crack, every gap in the floorboards, every ill-fitting window frame. This created a constant, invisible river of ice-cold air flowing across the floor toward the fire. Families were simultaneously being baked by radiant heat from the front and frozen by drafts from the back. And the hot air the fire produced? It was lighter than the cold air, so it immediately rose to the ceiling and was promptly sucked out of the house through the same chimney. Wilhelm calculated that nearly 80% of the heat generated by his neighbors' fires was going straight up into the sky to warm the eagles. Finally, there was the problem of radiation and thermal mass. A Franklin stove made of thin cast iron was designed to heat up quickly. It radiated intense heat, but it had no storage capacity. The moment the fire died down, the stove cooled, and the cabin temperature would crash. This demanded constant stoking day and night. To keep the house from freezing, a man had to get up every 2 hours in the dead of night to feed the iron beast. It was exhausting, inefficient, and wasteful. He saw the consequences everywhere. Thaddeus Cork, for all his building expertise, and Kraumbeskowski Krobinest burned a staggering 10 cords of wood each winter and still complained that his wife had to hang blankets over the walls to stop the frost from creeping into the room. Loomis Gar, the proprietor of the local feed store, joked grimly that his children had forgotten what it was like to walk barefoot, as the floor of his cabin was cold enough to numb the feet through 2 pairs of wool socks. The settlement treated this constant draining battle as a fact of life, a form of frontier stoicism. Wilhelm Strand saw it as a design problem begging for a solution. His solution began to take shape that autumn, stone by stone, under the watchful, skeptical eyes of the entire community. The structure he was building was a kakelun, a Swedish masonry heater. But lacking the fine ceramic tiles of his homeland, he was adapting the design using the materials the territory provided. Fieldstone, river rock, fire brick, ordered at great expense from St. Paul, and a carefully prepared mortar of sand and blue clay dug from the riverbank. First, he laid a foundation, a thick pad of packed earth and heavy stones, ensuring it was structurally independent from the cabin's own foundation. The heater would weigh over 4 tons when complete. It needed to carry its own immense weight. Upon this base, he constructed the firebox. It was shockingly small, no bigger than a small crate, and meticulously lined with the expensive fire brick. This was the engine of the entire system. Its small size was designed to create a concentrated, intensely hot fire, ensuring the wood burned quickly and completely. Then came the heart of the invention, the part that mystified his neighbors the most. Instead of a straight flue leading to a chimney, Wilhelm began building a labyrinth. Using more fire brick, he constructed a series of 5 interconnected vertical channels. The hot exhaust gases from the fire would be forced to travel through this serpentine path, up a channel, over a partition, down the next, back up, back down, a total journey of nearly 30 feet before they were allowed to exit the building. This was the heat exchanger. As he built this intricate brick core, the mockery intensified. Thaddeus Cork returned, this time with Loomis Gar in tow. "Strand, that's 1,000 pounds of rock for every pound of sense," Cork declared, shaking his head. "All that stone will soak up your heat and never give it back. On the prairie, a man needs a fast fire to fight a fast cold, not this slow foolishness." Wilhelm paused, setting a brick into a bed of wet clay. He looked at the 2 men, his expression calm. "The stone remembers the fire," he said, "long after the flame is gone." Loomis Gar, a practical man concerned with airflow and commerce, pointed at the convoluted flue system. "You'll smoke yourself out," he predicted with certainty. "My stove draws hard because the chimney is tall and straight. Without a proper draft, that thing will back up the first time the wind shifts. You'll be living in a smokehouse." Wilhelm pointed to the carefully constructed throat of the firebox, an angled passage leading into the first flue. "The draft is here," he explained patiently. "It is designed to pull, but it does not steal." The men just shook their heads and walked away, more convinced than ever of Strand's madness. Even his own wife, Elna, had her doubts. She watched him day after day as he methodically encased the entire brick labyrinth in a thick, solid shell of fieldstone and clay mortar. The final structure was enormous, a monolithic presence in their small living space. It was 8 feet long, 6 feet high, and 4 feet deep, its surface a mosaic of gray, tan, and rust-colored stones. One evening, as he was smoothing the final layer of clay mortar, Elna brought him a cup of water. She ran her hand over the cool, massive surface. "It looks like a baker's oven, Wilhelm," she said, her voice a mixture of trust and gentle worry. "Are you planning to bake the children to keep them warm?" He turned and gave her a rare, full smile. He patted the solid stone beside him. "No, my love," he said. "It will keep them warmer than any bread. You will see." The physics Wilhelm was employing were both ancient and elegant. The entire system was built around a single, powerful concept: thermal mass. His heater was, in essence, a heat battery. While his neighbors were using thin iron stoves that could hold no energy, Wilhelm had built a 4-ton stone sponge designed to soak up heat and release it slowly over a very long period. Here's how it worked. A small load of wood, perhaps 20 to 30 pounds, was placed in the firebox and lit. With the air intake wide open, it burned incredibly hot and fast, like a blacksmith's forge. Temperatures inside the firebox would exceed 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. This intense heat ensured near-perfect combustion, burning not just the wood, but the gases and particulates that would become smoke and creosote in a conventional air-starved stove. The resulting torrent of superheated gas, instead of escaping directly up a chimney, was forced into the 30-foot-long winding maze of brick flues. As the hot gases snaked their way through this labyrinth, their velocity slowed. They tumbled and swirled, spending a long time in contact with the interior walls of the flue system. The dense fire brick and the surrounding tons of stone began to absorb the heat energy. By the time the gases finally exited the system through a small vent near the floor on the outside wall, they had cooled to a mere 250 degrees. Over 80% of the fire's heat energy had been transferred and stored in the massive stone structure. After that one hot 90-minute burn, the fire was allowed to die out completely. Wilhelm would then close a damper at the exit flue, sealing the entire system. No cold air could get in, and no residual warmth could escape. Now the second phase began. The 8,000 pounds of stone, charged with thousands of BTUs of stored energy, began to release that heat, but it didn't release it like an iron stove, with scorching, high-temperature heat. It released it as gentle, low-temperature radiant heat. The entire 6-foot by 8-foot surface of the heater warmed to between 120 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to be pleasant to the touch, but not hot enough to burn. This massive warm surface radiated heat evenly in all directions, warming the floors, the walls, the furniture, and the people in the room directly. It created a pervasive, stable, and deeply comfortable warmth that was impossible to achieve with a conventional stove. One fire in the morning and one in the evening were all that was needed to keep the cabin at a steady temperature for a full 24 hours. Wilhelm had decoupled the act of burning from the act of heating. The winter of 1878 arrived not as a slow decline, but as an invading army. A November cold snap froze the Red River solid, and by mid-December the territory was in the grip of what would later be called the Big Freeze. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for 3 weeks. The wind was a constant, abrasive force, piling snow into drifts that buried fences and blocked roads. Then, in the first week of January, the bottom fell out. The mercury in the settlement's official thermometer at the trading post retreated into its bulb. The temperature plunged to 30, then 35, and finally settled at a terrifying 40 degrees below zero. At that temperature, metal became brittle, breath froze into a cloud of sharp crystals, and exposed skin would freeze in under a minute. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a waking nightmare. The battle against the cold became their entire existence. In Thaddeus Cork's cabin, the air was thick with wood smoke and the smell of fear. He was burning wood at a frantic pace, stuffing his stove until it glowed. His wife and 3 children were huddled together on the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Just a few feet away, the interior walls were covered in a thick white lacework of frost. His youngest son had developed a deep, rattling cough that echoed in the cold silence between gusts of wind. They slept in shifts to keep the fire from dying. Loomis Gar had to move his prize-milking cow and her new calf into the main room of his cabin to keep them from freezing to death in the barn. The animals' panicked breath mingled with the family's, and the floor was a treacherous mix of mud, hay, and ice. The door was sealed shut by a thick curtain of frozen condensation. Opal Jessup, the postmistress who ran her small office out of her home, announced that all mail service was suspended indefinitely. The horses simply could not operate in such conditions. She told a neighbor that she had resorted to burning old newspapers and then a broken chair just to keep her stove going through the night. The settlement was isolated, cold, and running out of fuel and hope. But at the Strand cabin, life continued with a calm, almost surreal normality. Each morning, Wilhelm would rise in the cool but not frigid air. The indoor temperature would have dropped to around 60 degrees overnight. He would load the small firebox with a few split logs and light it. For the next hour and a half, the fire would roar in its brick chamber, a contained and efficient inferno. Niels and Hedvig would watch, fascinated by the sound. Then, the fire would die down. Wilhelm would close the damper, and a profound, gentle warmth would begin to radiate from the massive stone heater. Within an hour, the cabin would be back to a stable 68 degrees, and it would hold that temperature all day. Elna would do her sewing in her shirt sleeves, her fingers nimble and warm. The children played with their wooden toys on the floorboards, which were pleasantly warm to the touch. The water bucket against the far wall would sometimes get a thin, transparent skim of ice on its surface overnight, but it never froze solid. They were comfortable. They were safe. Their woodpile, compared to their neighbors, seemed almost untouched. Wilhelm burned in a week what Thaddeus Cork burned in a day. He had not just built a better heater, he had defeated the winter itself. For 2 days, Thaddeus Cork stewed in a mixture of pride, fear, and disbelief. His son's cough was getting worse, and the woodpile was shrinking at an alarming rate. The thought of the mad Swede and his family, possibly frozen to death in their chimneyless cabin, gnawed at him. It was his duty as a neighbor, he told himself, to check. But another part of him, a part he wouldn't admit to, was terrified that Wilhelm had been right. Finally, he could stand it no longer. Bundled in layers of wool and buffalo hide, he plunged into the biting wind and deep snow, his face aching with the cold. The journey of 200 yards felt like a mile. As he approached Strand's cabin, he saw no smoke. A bad sign. He steeled himself for what he might find inside. He raised a numb, mittened hand and knocked heavily on the solid oak door. After a moment, the bar was lifted from inside and the door swung open. Wilhelm Strand stood there, dressed in simple trousers and a linen shirt. A wave of warm air washed over Cork's frozen face. It was the most shocking sensation he had ever felt. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove. It was a soft, enveloping, and complete warmth, like the air in June. He stared, speechless, into the cabin. He saw Elna at the table mending a shirt. He saw the 2 children playing on the floor, their cheeks rosy and healthy. There was no smoke. There was no draft. There was only a profound and peaceful warmth. "Cork," Wilhelm said, his voice calm. "Come in. It is cold outside." Thaddeus stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the howling wind. He unwrapped the scarf from his face and looked around, bewildered. His eyes fell on the massive stone heater. He cautiously reached out a bare hand and laid it flat against the stones. They were not hot. They were just deeply, wonderfully warm, like a sun-baked rock in August. The heat seemed to penetrate right into his bones, chasing away the deep chill. "How?" Cork finally managed to stammer, his voice cracking. "Where's the fire?" Wilhelm simply patted the warm stone beside him. "The fire works for 1 hour," he said. "The stone works all day." Cork sank onto a nearby bench, overwhelmed. He explained about his son's worsening cough, about the endless, exhausting fight to keep his own cabin barely above freezing. Wilhelm listened without a word of judgment. When Cork was finished, Elna spoke. "Bring your wife and the boy here," she said simply. "There is room. They will be warm." The next morning, a humbled Thaddeus Cork brought his wife and ailing son to the Strand cabin. The relief on his wife's face as she felt the gentle, pervasive warmth was a sight he would never forget. He returned to his own cold, empty cabin, and then, with a new purpose, went to find Loomis Gar. When Gar saw the inside of Wilhelm's home, his reaction was even more pronounced. A practical man of business, his mind immediately went to the economics of it. After touching the warm stone and seeing the comfortable family, he turned to Wilhelm with a single, urgent question. "How much wood do you burn in a day, Strand?" Wilhelm led him to a modest wood box by the heater. It was only about a quarter full. "This will last 2 days," he said. "Maybe 3 if the sun shines." Loomis Gar's jaw dropped. He stared at the small pile of wood, then back at the warm, spacious room. He burned more than that before his family even woke up for breakfast. In that moment, the mockery of the entire settlement collapsed into a silent, profound awe. The fool on the hill was a genius. The story of the warm Swedish cabin spread faster than a prairie fire. The conversion of Thaddeus Cork, the settlement's most respected builder, and Wilhelm's most vocal critic, was the tipping point. He became Wilhelm's greatest advocate, a man admitting his own ignorance with the zeal of a convert. "I have built 50 cabins in this territory," he announced to a stunned crowd at Gar's feed store. "And I want you all to know I built every single one of them wrong. That Swede, Wilhelm Strand, knows more about surviving a winter than any man I have ever met. I saw it with my own eyes. It was 70 degrees in his house at 40 below. That spring, as the snow melted to reveal a landscape hungry for new life, a quiet pilgrimage began. 3 families, including Loomis Gar's, approached Wilhelm, not with mockery, but with requests for help. They asked him to oversee the construction of masonry heaters in their own cabins. Wilhelm, a man who sought no fame or fortune, agreed without hesitation. He asked for no payment, only for the families to help each other haul the necessary stone and dig the clay. With Thaddeus Cork acting as his foreman and most eager apprentice, the work began. By the first snow of the following winter, 7 cabins in the Pembina settlement had been retrofitted with Swedish rock stoves. The results were immediate and transformative. Families reported cutting their wood consumption by 60 to 80%. The health of the community improved dramatically, with cases of winter coughs and sickness plummeting in the households with the new heaters. The quality of life was immeasurably better. Winter stopped being a siege and became simply a season. In 1880, the innovation attracted outside attention. A traveling agent for the Minnesota State Agricultural Society, a thoughtful man named Pearl Tackett, heard tales of the warm settlement and came to investigate. He spent 2 days with Wilhelm, meticulously documenting the heater's design, measuring fuel consumption, and recording interior temperatures. His official report on the efficient use of fuel in frontier dwellings, the Swedish masonry heater of Pembina, praised the design for its unmatched efficiency, safety, and creation of a healthy, stable, living environment. The quiet Swede's idea was beginning to spread. Decades before the formal language of building science existed, Wilhelm Strand had implemented its most advanced principles, using stone, clay, and inherited wisdom. His masonry heater was a masterpiece of passive heat storage and radiant heat delivery. It anticipated modern engineering concepts that wouldn't become mainstream for another century. The massive 4-ton heater is a perfect example of thermal mass construction. The principle of using dense materials to absorb and store solar or internal heat energy. The gentle, pervasive warmth it produced is exactly what modern radiant floor heating systems strive to achieve. By sealing the cabin with a damper after the fire was out, he created an airtight building envelope, now a cornerstone of energy-efficient home design. Modern studies on masonry heaters confirm the very figures Wilhelm demonstrated on the frontier: combustion efficiencies often exceeding 90% and a dramatic reduction in fuel use compared to any conventional stove. This wasn't primitive, it was profoundly advanced. In the end, the story of Wilhelm Strand is a quiet lesson in the nature of wisdom. The frontier, for all its hardships, was a place of ultimate pragmatism. It didn't reward credentials, opinions, or the loudest voice in the room. It rewarded what worked. Wilhelm never gloated. He never once said to Thaddeus Cork, "I told you so." When his neighbors came to him for help, he gave his knowledge freely, as a craftsman shares his trade. He had faced a fundamental problem. His family was cold and in danger, and he had solved it using the deep, time-tested knowledge that was his birthright. His neighbors had laughed because his solution was unfamiliar. They stopped laughing when the evidence became undeniable. That's how real wisdom spreads on the frontier, not through argument or persuasion, but through the undeniable proof of a warm house in the dead of winter. The mockery had lasted one autumn. The warmth and the respect it earned would last for generations. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary idea isn't a new invention at all, but a piece of forgotten common sense, waiting patiently for a problem sharp enough to demand its return. If you found this piece of forgotten history as fascinating as I do, please give this video a like and subscribe for more stories of quiet frontier ingenuity. What's the coldest winter you've ever had to endure? Let me know in the comments below. I read everyone. Disclaimer: the story you have just heard is a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. While the principles and techniques of masonry heaters are based on real historical practices, the specific characters, names, and sequence of events are fictional creations designed to illustrate a larger truth about innovation and survival. Any application of these building principles today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and with the guidance of qualified professionals. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.